Today, we are going back to May of 1999. The world is engrossed with the release of Star Wars Episode 1. Even the official PlayStation magazine was obsessed, with the magazine showcasing Episode 1 on the main cover of the month. Of course, this was in anticipation of covering the video game tie-in game, releasing for PS1 the same month. The classic movie tie-in games that were all too abundant back then, and somehow very sparse in the landscape of today. Opening the issue, we see the editorial by Craig Kujawa, sarcastically complaining about the overabundance of things to cover in the issue. The big two being the official announcement of the PS2 and the Star Wars Episode 1 games coming up. He talks a bit about traveling to Japan and attending Sony's PS2 event, how grandiose it was, and how it underlined how serious Sony was about the power and impact they believed that the PS2 would deliver. He talks about how before this event, that usually hardware demos were well-hidden affairs, appointment only, and usually in booths at trade shows. In contrast to that, Sony's event had about 1,500 people in attendance, showcasing the new system to a live audience. Kujawa reflects that many in attendance were overheard muttering how Sega, a large competitor in the hardware market at the time, would be in trouble against the new PlayStation. He does also remark at how Sony was great at making the PS1 a very affordable piece of hardware at the time of release, and imagines that the PS2 will follow suit. He says that he can't wait to be able to wait in line and buy a new PlayStation again just at midnight, just like we all used to do with games and hardware back in the day. Overall, I really enjoyed reading through his thoughts on this. Looking back 24 years later, it kind of makes you realize how jaded the gaming world has become compared to that of the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's kind of refreshing to see like a positive take on waiting for new hardware. We get to the contents of the month, and our main bits of coverage involve 4 games: the Phantom Menace movie tie-in game, Wipeout 3, Marvel vs. Street Fighter, and Legend of Legaia, which is actually on our demo disc for the month. The fan-submitted letters and art are always an interesting read. How we had a person complaining about the appearance of the game stick, or a letter all the way back in 1999 about female gamers. Yeah, some things they just don't change, do they? We see the physical mailbox of PlayStation Magazine, a P.O. box in Oak Brook, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, which was surprising to me. I always just kind of figured that all of these things were headquartered in California at the time. A good old fax number, which I'm all but sure doesn't work anymore, and an old email address, which either has a new owner by now or isn't checked at all these years later. Now we get into the news section of the month. It's littered with information on the PS2, a full stat sheet, bragging about the new 128-bit Emotion engine, pushing a system clock of 300 megahertz. That's cutting edge. This section goes into far more detail about the Tokyo-based event that served as the unveiling of the PS2 that the editor mentioned earlier. The magazine says, guessing the price point would be around $299, a prediction that would later prove pretty accurate. And they highlight the backwards compatibility of the PS2, that it would play all PS1 games and allow the usage of PS1 controllers and memory cards, something we as gamers today wish everything did. Backwards compatibility being left in the dust is not great. I mean, at least the PS5 plays PS4 games, I guess. They talk about the PS2 using DVD technology and how it will allow for much larger and more graphically intensive games, utilizing the full 4.7 gigabytes of space, which at that point in time was absolutely massive compared to anything else we had available for gaming at the time, most of which was either CD-ROMs or in Nintendo's case still cartridge-based. An interesting point here is that in May of '99, Sony had not yet decided if it was going to allow the PS2 to play DVD movies. They eventually would, as we all know, and it was a pretty big deciding factor for quite a few people to buy a PS2 console, since it did double as a DVD player, and ultimately that was a good choice on Sony's part. Sony was also looking a bit ahead here as well. It mentioned that Sony said online gaming is very attractive, but the infrastructure of the internet is not satisfactory at the moment. It's very easy for us to give the system communication capabilities through the USB and PCM-CIA interfaces, but it's all going to be down to the application of the software in the end. Essentially, they were looking forward to the future of online gaming, but they weren't ready to enter that foray or put it at the forefront of the PS2 at the time. One last bit here poses the question of how many controller ports the PS2 would have, with PlayStation Magazine saying, "It seems like a no-brainer that the PS2 will have 4. One of the few predictions that they actually did get wrong, as we know Sony would stick with just 2, just like the PS1. There's a small segment here that goes over a poll that they did on videogames.com that actually said most people were believing that the PS2 was exceeding expectations for them at the time. We could surmise that there was good excitement at this point for the console. From just a personal perspective, I remember decent excitement for it, but I was like 8, so take that with a grain of salt. On the side of the magazine, we see 10 things that we think this month. Number 2 being backwards compatibility is a good idea. I absolutely agree. Number 4, it's a good time to be a PlayStation fan. And in May of 1999, I would say that's absolutely a true statement. And then number 6 is a funny one that just talks about how the new Emotion engine would make those Japanese girlfriend simulators more realistic. And number 10, Sega screwed. Yeah, that was true too. We get a very neat glimpse into the game sales as well, showing us the top 20 selling games for the previous month in the US. Starting off with WCW NWO Thunder, which, wrestling was huge at the time, so it does make sense. Frogger, Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, and in 5th place, Rugrats, Search for Reptar, which, hey, I loved Rugrats. We get an ad for Legend of Legaia, our highlight demo game of the month, saying that if this were Los Angeles, it would be considered a stage 8000 smog alert. I will admit I actually chuckled seeing that in 2024. It's something I wouldn't imagine a company doing today. It seems odd and a little out of place, especially for a JRPG of all things, but it was eye-catching, so they definitely did their job. Driver and 3 Extreme, which are both on the demo disc for the month as videos, not playable, are shown in the preview section here. After the preview section, we get to the highlight of the month, which was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. The article talks about how the game is actually being developed for PC first, meaning that the PlayStation version is actually a port. The game was being developed by Big Ape Productions, who were responsible for Zombies Ate My Neighbors. They highlight how the movie tie-in games have to be a little different than the norm, and that Big Ape will need to shift the focus, and instead of focusing on collecting weapons and power-ups, they're taking a much larger portion of time to create puzzles, character interaction, and exploration. PlayStation Magazine seems proud to be able to show the first screenshots seen anywhere about the game at the top of the page, showcasing environments and the perspective that the game is being played from. The game is said to have voice acting, some by the actual actors and some by sound-alikes. Big Ape actually mentions that sometimes the sound-alikes are actually the ones delivering better lines, since the actors are not familiar with doing video game voice acting and aren't as into it. What seems strange to me as a reader is something mentioned a little later in the article. Pavis, who's part of the team who's working on the PlayStation port, says that he was pulled from another LucasArts game to be a part of the team porting Phantom Menace. They didn't even begin work on the port until January, and according to Pavis himself, it needed to be done and sent off to Sony by early April to ensure a concurrent release with the movie. That seems like insane crunch to me, but I'm unsure if it is. I don't know if this was standard for people at the time, especially with how we view video game crunch time now. It seems like this has likely been pervasive throughout the industry for forever. What does seem to be a highlight here, though, is the closing segment, Phantom Fanatics, where they describe the team working on the game as people for whom Star Wars is an inseparable part of their culture. Like many of us, these folks have been Star Wars fans from elementary school or before. Anytime a group of passionate people are working on a product, it tends to be faithful. I should boot up episode 1 at some point and do a review on it. The game does have a user score of 7.4 on Metacritic, so it has to be at least decent. I will say the article swayed me a little bit here. Now we arrive at the review section. The first reviewed game is one of the ones on the demo disc, Gex Deep Cover Gecko, receiving a 3.5 out of 5. The magazine praised its graphics and abundance of secrets while criticizing its shallow combat and repetitive comments that Gex makes. Ridge Racer 4 got a 4 out of 5. Need for Speed High Stakes slightly beat it out with a 4.5. Point Blank 2 got a 3.5. Triple Play 2000, the old EA series of baseball games, got a 4.5. Trag, which is described as Resident Evil meets sci-fi Die Hard, got a 3. And Hello Kitty's Cube Frenzy got a whopping 2.5. The strategy section gives us an early walkthrough of Legend of Legaia and a good section on Marvel superheroes vs. Street Fighter, showcasing beginner combos, special moves, and more, which honestly is pretty great for $19.99 and anyone who was looking to get into fighting games at that point, because the breadth of information on the internet is not that it is today, so you actually would use things like this. Following the strategy section, we get some cheats and tricks, a classic for gaming magazines to add toward the end, and some toy advertisements. Last but not least is a section on the demo disc itself, showcasing each game and a decent amount of tips, along with just thoughts from the magazine staff themselves. Urgai's is called probably the best looking fighter for the PlayStation. Gex 3 just refers back to the review from earlier. Legend of Legaia adds a tiny walkthrough for just the demo, and says that if you needed this, you'll need it for the full game. So definitely refer back to their walkthrough from earlier. Ultimately saying that if you're a fan of RPG games, you should definitely not skip Legend of Legaia. Contender doesn't even give thoughts. Take that for what you will. The only other standout here was a comment about Gauntlet Legends video from the demo, which perfectly encapsulated my thoughts when I watched it. What the hell does it have to do with the game? Now on to the contents of the demo disc of the month. It starts off with an animation of discs being made at a factory. The factory setup will serve as our demo screen for the month, moving the contents of the demo along the belt of the machinery to select either the demo or the video. For playable demos this month, we have Legend of Legaia, Urgai's, Gex 3, and Contender. For video trailers, we have Centipede, G-Police 2, Gauntlet Legends, Driver, Threads, and 3 Extreme. 3 Extreme is an extreme sports game, the third in the series from developer 989 Studios. Threads is just an advertisement for buyable merch from the PlayStation.com store, showcasing wearable merch for sale from the website. Driver is a captured replay from the game, which is a bit funny to me that they just used the replay feature to make the trailer itself. Gauntlet Legends is a video that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual game and just shows a wizard getting absolutely wrecked. G-Police is a pretty standard fare trailer for the time, shows some text describing the game and then some gameplay. And then Centipede is like a weird fever dream video that absolutely was doing work for what I can only believe the game actually is like. I feel like the trailer probably hypes it up a bit more than the game deserves. Contender, our first playable demo, is a boxing game. I'm pretty sure Contender was a budget title even back then. I remember seeing this all the time in those like $10 PS1 game areas as a kid. And for what it's worth, it's okay. If you enjoy boxing games, it's probably pretty fun, but there were better options back then, and I can see why it was mostly forgotten. Gex 3 is a 3D platforming game that is a bit hard to control and clunky. Urgai's is probably the most exciting part of the demo in my opinion. I always wanted this game as a kid, and while it still eludes me today, I want to play it and cover it soon. It's a Squaresoft fighting game, which also featured Tifa, Sephiroth, and Cloud from FF7. Urgai's was an over-the-top 3D fighter that was pretty fast-paced, and from what I can tell of the demo, it was an absolute blast. And this is definitely the most fun game I played on the disc. Last but not least is the main game marketed on the disc, which is Legend of Legaia. It has a ton of exposition, which is, for a demo, I think a bit much, but it does kind of get you set into that JRPG feel and might be necessary for really what it's trying to get you to feel and want to buy. The demo is mostly interacting with the townfolk, some of which actually point out the fact that it is a demo and they don't really belong here and won't be there in the full game. The save feature obviously doesn't work, and it's even said that it doesn't because it's a demo. I actually enjoyed that they took the time to code these extra little bits. It kind of is fun to me that they point out, hey, this is just a demo, so it's going to be different. The combat seems interesting, and the world building was pretty good. It did its job of trying to pull you in and get that sale with getting you interested in the story and the world, and the action is pretty different for JRPGs at the time, so I think they did a good job with this demo overall. And that sums up Official PlayStation Magazine of May 1999. $7.99 worth of value back then would have run you about $15 today, to put it in perspective. A value that, when adding the demo disc, many of us viewed as fair back then. It was one of the few ways you could get good video game info back then, to know what was coming out, to know reviews, to know kind of what you should look at. I remember loving the demo discs as a kid, and I still do today, and always begging for a magazine every time I went to the store. I plan on doing more of these deep dives into demo discs and the corresponding magazine of the month, so I do hope you'll give me a follow if you enjoyed this look back, and I appreciate you watching. If you want to see the raw footage of the demo disc with no commentary, it's on my second channel, just for the gameplay. The link is in the description, and thank you so much for watching.